Alrighty, what we're going to try to do again is do a little demonstration. This is kind of what I do at work when I do the demos there. If you're not familiar with the types of paint out there, there are lots of different brands. At work I use the Grumbacher. It's a good student grade and professional grade or artist grade paint. It's got lots of pigment in there. I also like the golden fluid. Let me raise it up a little bit. Lots of pigment. It's almost like watercolor. It's kind of got a glue-like consistency. It's not as thin as some of my acrylic inks, but it's really good stuff. The Liquitex Basics, that's like a student grade, so there's a lot more binder than there is actual pigment, but they're not bad. It's a good student grade. It's a good starter paint, but it does tend to be kind of plasticky. Winsor Newton is another really old brand. It's been around forever. It's pretty decent. The Galleria is another student grade. And it's decent. It's okay. Again, it's kind of plasticky. I don't recommend like the Reeves. That tends to be like a kiddie grade. It's not very good. But let's get started now. I'm going to use... I've already used this once, so it's not very good. This is just a styrofoam plate, but they make really good paint palettes. Actually, I think I'm going to swap it out with the one I have underneath here, because this one has less paint in it. This is just a painting board. It's kind of messy looking right now because I painted something underneath it, and I wanted to reuse it. These are great for practicing, but they do have some flaws. When you first start using them, they don't have a lot of tooth to the surface, so it's real easy for the paint to kind of slip off during certain types of techniques. So I do recommend getting some gesso. I like clear gesso. Liquitex, there's another product endorsement. Has a great clear gesso. You can mix it in with your paints and it won't change the color. Make sure it's clear. You can also paint it over or under your painting to help make sure it stays in there good. Alrighty, I'm gonna get started here. We're gonna do a beach scene, nice and simple. It's very popular around here. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take some white. I'm gonna use my titanium white. Not all whites are opaque. Opaque means you can't see through it. And in this case we don't, because we want to make sure it's nice and flat. Something you'll notice when you're painting with acrylics is you have to do a lot of layers with it before it starts looking decent. We're going to use some phthalo blue. Phthalo blue is really strong, so you don't need a whole lot of it. A little bit goes a long, long way. Let me show you a little bit. I mean, barely need any, because what we're going to do is the sky and then the water. And I do recommend having a nice big pail for your water. I'm being bad and I'm only using a little bit of water, but that's because I don't really have a lot of room up here. And you could use a big brush. I'm going to use one of my little spastic brushes here. It's really important when you're using acrylics to wash your brush out. Don't leave it around. Unlike oils, if you leave your brush full of paint, it will dry really fast, and then your brush will be dead. And it only takes a few minutes for the paint to dry on your bristles and kill your brush. That's the other reason I like synthetic brushes. If you kill it, it's usually under $10, so there's nothing to cry about. Acrylics also dry darker than what you mix them, so that's something to keep in mind when you're painting and mixing. You always want to mix the color a lot lighter than you really want it to be, because when it dries, it's going to be a couple shades lighter or darker. Alrighty. And for those of you listening to this later on, because I'm going to record it, if I seem to answer random strange questions out of the blue, it's because I'm responding to the chat that's going on right now. Alright, hopefully you guys can see that this is a fairly light blue, and I'm just putting down a flat coat, and we're going to go over it a couple times. Depending upon the type of paint you have and the type of surface you're painting on, you may have to do this more or less. Also depending upon what kind of paint you're using. Some paints can do more in less time and in less coats. It just depends on how strong it is. The Liquitex tends to be pretty good. That's why I like using the white. I use it for a base for a lot of my colors because I know it'll really do a good coverage. When I'm painting Seascape, sometimes I use reference. Today I'm not. I'm just going to make it out of my head because I've painted this scene so many times now. I'm just kind of going to do a traditional sand dunes and water. You can do a sketch underneath there if you want. Don't necessarily have to. That's the nice thing about acrylics. You can do a lot of things on the fly, and if you mess up, you just paint over it because it dries real fast. I'm also going to try to do a little bit of blending. When I paint on these little canvases at work, the idea is we're supposed to be able to do this within 2 hours. So there's not a whole lot of detail, and I also tend not to do too much blending because acrylics do dry so fast. To do blending, you either have to have a really humid day, like fortunately it is today because it's been raining all day, or have a surface that isn't super absorbent. Because I've painted over this a couple times and because there's a lot of gesso on underneath it, it's not going to dry super fast, so I'm going to be able to get away with blending without adding any extra mediums. Alrighty, here we go. And I'm just darkening the top a little bit because the sky usually is not one uniform color of blue. There's usually a little bit of variation. And I am certainly going to add some clouds later. I think I'm going to stand up, make this a little bit easier. Whee! And once the sky is dry, more or less, I'm going to add in clouds. You could add in the clouds right now if you wanted, you know, but they'd be really blendy, and I don't want to do that because you'll spend a lot of time waiting to go over things because it keeps blending. There we go. It's fairly decent. And now I'm going to do the ocean. And I'm going to use more of the phthalo because I want a nice pretty Hawaiian blue ocean. Whee! And something I have to note all the time in my classes is add more water. Acrylics are a water-based media. You don't need to use turpentine, which is good because turpentine is kind of toxic and it smells. But if you find that the paint is kind of fighting you along the paper or the canvas, and you're getting a lot of roughness, kind of like right there, that means you need to add more water. You don't want to get it so it's so soupy that's like watercolor, but you need enough water that it flows nicely. And if your hand shakes like mine, it's okay. You can kind of hold it with your other hand to try to get it straight. Or you can cheat and get a stick to lean against. There are all sorts of ways. You can also just go back and forth a couple times until it's more or less straight. If it means turning the canvas a certain way, that's okay. Artists cheat a lot. If it makes it easier and still looks good, it's okay. There we go. And I'm not going to go all the way down because I'm going to put sand dunes in the way. I'm going to pause a moment so I can look and see what everybody's chatting about. Okay, if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Alrighty. There we go. Alright, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of green. And I have some Hooker's green. There you go. And again, a little bit goes a long way, so I'm just, you know, not even a dime's worth of paint, just a little bit. Just a wee bit. My dot right there. I'm going to mix that in with the darker blue I have. I'm going to add a little bit more. I'm going to mix that in. I know it's kind of hard to see in the camera, but it's just kind of lightly in there anyway. It's a nice Hawaiian blue water here. And again, not going to do a whole lot of detail, just enough to get us where we want to go. No, it's Hooker's green. Hookers. You find Hooker's green in watercolor too. See, I know it's probably out of focus. I don't know who Hooker is and why he likes green, but he does. Alright, now what you can do is you can see, I think that my paint looks still kind of shiny at the top, but I'm going to try to add some clouds at the top. They're probably going to be a little smeary, but that's alright. You can never have too many brushes. I have lots of these. And I'm going to do a little bit of a dry brush technique here. I'm not adding any water, but I am squishing my paintbrush down pretty good, nice and flat. So, and then I'm going to do poofy, happy little clouds. And it's okay if they don't look good at first, because there's a lot of building up of colors when you do acrylics. Usually it doesn't look good until you've gone over it a couple times. And use the shape of the brush to your advantage. If it's big and fat, that's good sometimes, but you can use it sideways and long ways. And what I'm going to do is smear some of the paint off the brush by scraping it against the side of the palette. And then I'm lightly going to brush this down. And this is going to work nicely because the paint behind it is still fairly wet, so it will blend in there. Then I'm lightly going to move it side to side, kind of blend it in. And it's sticking a little bit, so I'm going to wash off my brush here. And usually when I paint, I have a lot of paper towels around, but I don't today, so I'm just going to use this washcloth. Shame on me. And with a slightly damp brush here, I'm going to come down here and smooth and blend that in. And I'm barely touching the canvas at all, just really light. You do have to be careful on these canvases though when you start getting slightly wet paint that's also slightly dry, is it will also rub off. The paint will just move off. And as you see, I smeared some of my water here, but that's okay. You just blend it back into the painting. So one really wonderful thing about acrylics is they're really forgiving. If you screw up, it's easy to paint over. I'll just add a little bit more sky blue here. I know it looks kind of light, but that's alright. It will darken as it dries. And just brush it in. See? No worries. Woohoo! I'm going to switch to another brush. This is a round. I like the round brushes. It's round. There you go. This is a number 4. And I'm going to lean over here to see what people are saying. Alrighty. Yeah, no, you know, if you mess up, it's okay. It's easy to fix. And I'm going to re-emphasize the shapes of the clouds here. When you're painting with acrylics, you want to use the biggest brush you can get away with to complete the task. That helps keep it from looking overworked. But since I'm trying to just kind of highlight what's already there, that's why I'm using the smaller brush. You can also use the fan brush for this. There's not really a right or wrong brush for a task. You know, it's kind of just whatever you happen to have handy and feel like using. But, you know, there's always brushes that are better suited to certain things than others. I know this brush is brown, but it is also synthetic. I don't have any real sable or squirrel or boar hair. I don't like the boar hair brushes. They tend to be too rough for the type of painting I like to do. I also found that they have a tendency to shed real bad. And I'm just taking a fan brush here, and it's dry. There's no water on it. And I'm just brushing down some of the paint from the clouds, blending it in back there. And just really lightly touching the canvas, just really light. Because again, the paint can come off, so you want to be gentle. You're not stenciling. And I put a little bit of water on the brush here to help blend a little better. Get another filbert brush, lightly smoothing things back down again. I'm going to add more white. Just kind of dab some of the areas and bring it down a little bit. And I'm just using the very tip of the brush. I'm going to add a little bit more white here to my palette. What I'm doing is kind of adding some thicker spots and letting other areas be a little bit more transparent, because that helps give it kind of a 3D poofy cotton candy effect. And again, I'm just going to come in here with another dry brush and brush it down, kind of blend it in there. It's not quite so stark. This is why I like having a lot of the same brush, you know, because once you've used it for dry brush technique, you want to wash it off as soon as possible so the paint doesn't dry. You can do this with oils and do it a little bit more safely because the oils don't dry quite as fast. Can't get away with that in acrylics quite as well, fortunately. But you can still make the nice transition effects. You just have to be a little bit more careful with your brushes. A little bit, add more of the normal blue here. Okay, and now rinse off my brushes here. I'm going to peer at what people are saying in the chat. Oh, alright. Let's set this aside. For cleaning your brushes, I recommend using Dawn dish detergent. It's non-toxic, of course, and it's really good for washing your brushes off. It's also cheap. It's what a lot of artist soap is made out of, but you know, they just mark it up. Whoops. Right now, let's see if the blue is dry. That's dry enough, so we're going to move on to the next layer, which of course is going to be the sand. And I'm going to use some of this yellowy orange here. This is yellow oxide. It also kind of looks like raw sienna a little bit, except for it's trying to dry on me. Some leftover paint from when I did some other project. It's very plasticky looking, but there are medias that you can stick in your paint to keep it from getting so plasticky looking, like matte medium. Let's see here, I've got some. That's slow dry. There we go, matte medium by Liquitex. If you pour just a little bit of this into your paints while you're painting, it will help keep your paints from getting that, you know, plastic look, which is awfully nice. Alright, I'm going to take some of the kind of orangey yellow here. Orangey yellow. I'm going to add that into my white, and then I'm going to add more white. What you also want to do when you're painting is use a little bit of the major color, in this case blue, in all of the paint colors you mix, and that will help keep your painting unified. Otherwise it has a tendency to look like a quilt. You don't want to use too much water in this part, and the consistency I'm using for the sand is going to be kind of watered down paste, like Elmer's glue, because we're going to be covering up some of the ocean colors that we put down before. And if it doesn't cover completely, that's okay, because you can do another coat. You usually have to. Something else that people often have a problem with when they're mixing colors is not being able to mix the colors properly. It's challenging. Even I have problems mixing colors, so that's why I have a recipe book. You can buy one. I don't know where mine's at currently, but you can buy them for acrylics or watercolors. Once you have a recipe, you can pretty much use it for any type of media. You know, there usually isn't too much of a difference between the different types of colors. Though I will say certain colors do cost more than others, depending upon what it's made out of. Some ingredients are just more expensive than others. Like certain purples and reds can be expensive. Certain blues. So that's something to take into account when you're buying your paint. Whee! And we're just going to make the dunes. The reason I'm putting the dunes on the side like this is it's a common practice for this style of painting to have the dunes coming in from either side. It helps kind of frame the composition. I like kind of having one dune a little bit bigger than the other, so it's not quite so perfect. And you don't want to cover up the ocean too much. But you see, like right here, I know it's kind of hard to tell in the camera. Let's see if I can move it up higher. See how you kind of see through that? You just wait for that to dry a little bit and then you go over it some more. Alrighty. Whoops. Shaky table is shaky. I'm going to add a little bit more on this side. We're going to have to wait for that to dry a little bit more. Something you can do if you're impatient like me, or you don't have a whole lot of time, is you can get a hairdryer. I'm not going to right now because it's going to make a lot of noise. But you just take a hairdryer and you blow it over. Try to keep the heat on like the low or medium settings, because again, this is plastic you're painting with more or less, and it can get hot. It won't melt, but it can get so hot that if it touches something, the paint will come up off the painting or the surface you're painting on. And you wait for it to cool a little bit. But while it's doing that, I'm going to play around with the water some more. And I'm going to take some more phthalo, because the phthalo is pretty. And since this particular picture has a fair amount of gesso on underneath it, I'm going to attempt to do some glazing. Glazing is kind of like using a watercolor technique. You use a lot more water than you use pigment. I don't want this to get too dark, but it's going to be fairly dark because we're going to do some of the shadows. You just have to be careful. This works really good if you're using like paper or real canvas instead of the canvas board.